The U-boat designated as U-111 was commissioned by the German Imperial Navy in 1917, being launched on September 5, 1917, and finally commissioned on the second last day of that same year. It had been built by Bremer Vulcan under subcontract to the Germania Werft in Kiel, northern Germany. At its helm was Kapitänleutnant or Lieutenant Captain Hans Beiersdorf. As an interesting bit of trivia, U-111 was the only U-boat with an ordained clergyman on board, a man by the name of Wilhelm Meinhold, who was designated as a Marinefarer or naval chaplain. As for her specifications, U-111 was 235.5 feet, or 71.7 meters in length, and 20.75 feet, or 6.3 meters in width at her bow. She was not a particularly large submarine, so her displacement was 798 tons when surfaced and 996 tons when submerged. As such, she could only accommodate 36 crew on board. U-111 was able to attain a decent top speed of 16.4 knots when surfaced and 8.4 knots when submerged. In early January 1918, she was dispatched to the Kiel School for final trials before joining the 4th U-Flotilla of the Hochseeflotte, or High Seas Fleet, on March 17, 1918. She finally left for her first patrol on March 25, 1918. All of this was already very late in the war, with Imperial Germany's defeat coming less than 8 months later. Yet hopes still remained high in the Kaisermarine as to what the latest fleet of U-boats could achieve. U-111's first mission was to patrol the waters of the St. George's Channel in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Wales. Her first successful hit came on April 7, 1918, off the coast of Wales, when she sighted and attacked the armed merchant ship, the Boscastle. Just a single torpedo is all it took to sink the British ship, with all 18 men on board losing their lives. Her second patrol commenced on May 27, and her next hit happened the very next day, May 28. The target was the Danish 393-ton Dronning Margrethe, a steamer en route from Göteborg in Sweden to Rouen, France. Its cargo was wood pulp. Being a much smaller vessel, Captain Lieutenant Beiersdorf decided to fire on the Danish ship and sink her by using the U-boat's deck guns, instead of wasting a torpedo. It was on her way back from the St. George's Channel to conclude her second patrol that U-111 came upon a Norwegian sailing vessel, the 272-ton Rana. Her cargo was timber destined for English mines. Once again, Beiersdorf opted to use his boat's 4.1-inch and 3.4-inch deck guns to sink the Norwegian vessel. Her third patrol, which commenced out of Wilhelmshaven on August 25, 1918, was her least successful. Her patrol in the Irish Sea came to nothing as stormy weather and heavy seas hampered her voyage. This last patrol ended at the port of Emden in northwest Germany on September 30, 1918. The war would come to an official end 42 days later. U-111 was still anchored at Emden on that day. She was surrendered to the Allies 9 days later. After the armistice in Versailles that ended the First World War was signed, all seaworthy U-boats were sent to the port of Harwich in Essex in southeastern England. Most of the U-boats were cut up for scrap metal. However, a handful of U-boats were saved so that Allied forces could reverse engineer the German subs. The Allies were particularly keen to understand German technology in diesel engines, periscopes, and gyroscopes, which were advanced. U-111 was one of those U-boats selected for dissection, so to speak. The United States was allocated 6 of these chosen U-boats, none of which initially included U-111, by the way. 12 American officers and 120 enlisted men arrived in England in March 1919 to ferry their allotted 6 submarines back to the U.S. However, one of the 6 submarines, U-164, was in such an atrocious and dilapidated state that the Americans refused to take her. Instead, they bargained with the British for another U-boat in far better condition. That substitute U-boat was U-111. Footage is actually available of British sailors standing on top of the surrendered U-111 in the Manchester Ship Canal as they greet the then visiting U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. It was President Wilson who had ordered the 6 U-boats be sent to the U.S. in order to tour the East Coast and raise money from the public for war bonds. The fleet of 6 U-boats destined for the U.S. would leave Harwich on April 3, 1919, and were scheduled to arrive in New York City no later than April 23, less than 3 weeks later. It would be a momentous journey for all concerned. However, U-111 was still undergoing repairs by the time the other 5 U-boats were ready to leave and set sail for the Azores Islands en route to America. And so it was decided by Commander Freeland Dobbin, the man in charge of U-111 now, that his U-boat would go it alone. That was a huge risk for U-111, given that many of the Americans that were to crew the U-boat had never even been inside a U-boat, and were taking a sub with signage entirely in a foreign language. To add, American sailors at that time were still used to navigating with compasses, whereas the U-boat used far more sophisticated gyroscopes for navigation, which were entirely new to the Americans. The U-boat also only had a low-power radio on board. Furthermore, Dobbin had also decided that he would take the shortest route across the North Atlantic, known as the Northern Route. It was the most dangerous route across the Atlantic at that time of year, as it was strewn with icebergs. In fact, it would be the exact same route undertaken by none other than RMS Titanic, the luxury cruise liner which had famously and tragically sunk when it struck an iceberg almost exactly 7 years earlier. Just 4 days into U-111's solo trip across the Atlantic saw the sub suddenly take on water and almost sink. The Germans had secretly installed a soluble plug in order to sabotage the U-boat before handing it over to the Allies. It was only the quick thinking and bravery of a chief gunner's mate, who dove into murky, oily water to plug up the hole, which ensured U-111 was saved from sinking with all on board. Things quickly got lousy on board the cramped vessel when food supplies provided by the British, which was supposed to be enough for 3 weeks, ran out in just a week. It was also cold and damp on board as the U-boat had no working heating to keep the men warm. To add to the misery, U-111 was running low on fuel, and the crew were forced to hatch a plan to hoist a makeshift sail were the engine to stop working. Conditions must have been hellish on that creaking, dank sub. Nevertheless, Dobbin and his jubilant American crew arrived aboard U-111 into New York City on April 19, 1919. It had taken just 12 days for the submarine to make the journey across the Atlantic. Even more incredibly, the sole U-boat had arrived 2 days before the other 5 U-boats which had left Britain before it. U-111 would be transferred to a dry dock at Maine's Portsmouth Naval Yard in March 1921, where it was flanked by 2 American submarines, the USS S-15 and USS S-16. This configuration was done to allow American engineers to easily compare the hull designs of the German and American submarines. U-111 then went on its victory bond tour of ports on the East Coast, specifically the coast of New England. It attracted huge crowds of curious civilians and military men wherever it went. The Times and Evening Farmer newspaper in Bridgeport, Connecticut had this to say: "The visits of the captured Hun pirates, harmless and toy-like now, will do much to call to the attention of the people the daring of our men who fought these underseas dastards." Of course, the other reason the United States brought U-111 and 5 other U-boats over was to study and reverse engineer the German subs where possible. To that end, a comparative study between U-111 and the American sub S-3, or submarine number 107, took place in the autumn of 1919. The German U-boat fared surprisingly poorly in the comparative analysis. For example, the American sub was found to be faster on both the surface and when submerged. The American boat was also found to have a far wider range at 10,000 miles compared to the 8,500 miles at 8 knots for the U-boat. In the end, the assessment concluded that U-111 was congested, overly complicated, and difficult to maintain. The S-3, on the other hand, was evaluated as being habitable, accessible, and more seaworthy. How much of these findings were tarnished by American patriotism is uncertain, but the evaluation of U-111 was hardly glowing. After the assessment, U-111 undertook mechanical efficiency experiments off the coasts of Florida and Cuba, after which she was sent to Portsmouth Navy Yard in New Hampshire. She was to be readied for decommissioning and thereafter her disposal. The plan was that U-111, along with the other U-boats, would be sunk off the North Carolina coast. This would be under the auspices of what was dubbed the Billy Mitchell Fleet. It was named that after Billy Mitchell, an Air Force brigadier general, who was obsessed with demonstrating that ships were better scuttled when bombarded by aircraft. The Navy had agreed to his plan. U-111's initial scuttling had her scheduled to be used as target practice by aerial bombings. However, U-111 would suffer her first sinking on June 18, 1922, while being towed south from Portsmouth, New Hampshire to Cape Hatteras on the North Carolina coast. She suddenly started taking on water while being towed by a minesweeper and sank about 3 miles or 5 kilometers off Cape Henry near Virginia Beach, some 150 miles or 240 kilometers short of Cape Hatteras. U-111 sank in only 35 feet or 10.6 meters of water, so her stern remained protruding out of the water. Being like that made U-111 a navigational hazard, so she was raised on August 14, 1922 by the USS Falcon. The U-boat was placed on pontoons and arrived back at Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia, where she promptly sank again in No. 3 dry dock. She was refloated once again after frantic pumping took place. Light repairs were then made so that she could be prepped for her final journey out to sea. The Washington Naval Treaty is worth noting here. The treaty was signed between 5 nations, namely the U.S., Britain, Japan, Italy, and France, in order to limit the total tonnage allowed per nation. This meant that all excess warships, including seized foreign vessels, had to be scuttled by July 1, 1922. Sinking twice meant U-111 had clearly missed that deadline. Finally, U-111 was hauled out into the Atlantic Ocean off Virginia on August 31, 1922, where she was scuttled with explosive charges and sank to the bottom. Navy records at the time of her scuttling indicated that she had sunk in 1,600 feet or 487 meters of water. That would put her far beyond the limit of any human diver. She was considered lost forever and would remain the sole missing boat of the 9 vessels scuttled in the so-called Billy Mitchell wrecks. Some professional wreck divers weren't convinced that she was that deep, however. Gary Gentile and Ken Clayton were 2 such wreck divers. They noted the coordinates of the sunken ship, which were available in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Gary Gentile would note the following: "When I plotted the coordinates on a chart, I noticed an anomaly. The depth of water at the given latitude and longitude did not correspond with the depth that was recorded in the log. It was shallower by hundreds of feet." Gentile was convinced U-111 was in far more shallow waters. He was right. However, it would be Eric Petkovich, another wreck diving expert, and his team that would finally locate the sunken and elusive U-boat in the darkened cabin of their RV Explorer submersible. That occurred on Labor Day in 2022, some 40 miles or 60-odd miles off the Virginia coast. The location of the sunken submarine's conning tower, along with other specific dimensions of the wreck, made it clear it was U-111. Finally, the last of the Billy Mitchell wrecks had been found. National Geographic wrote a feature about the find, stating how U-111 is the last known enemy submarine wreck from World War I in waters off the eastern seaboard. Rather cryptically, the article adds, "and never should have been found." One can debate the merits or not of finding a wreck such as U-111. For now, she remains on the seabed. It seems fitting. After seeming to fight so hard not to be scuttled, U-111 finally rests in peace